when we left our natural garden, vegan-based state. And this happened again roughly 7,000 years ago. And I'm showing you how we transitioned from this golden age pre-dynastic time to this modern dynastic time of government rule and meat-based societies. You can see what we mean by gender wars now. Different ideologies of matriarchal rulership or patriarchal rulership. And the differences was what I just explained. The older natural matriarchal ideologies says nature shows us we shouldn't hunt. Apples aren't running away from you. They're actually seducing you to eat them because they need you to reproduce. That same fragrance that the fruits give off to seduce humans to eat them, we use in soaps and lotions and perfumes that are scented like watermelon, oranges, and they basically reverse the science of nature and put themselves in between us and nature. Nature wore the seductive perfume to seduce you. If you walk past a peach tree, you can't help but pick one. I'm from the South. It smells lovely. And, you know, they got peach flavored perfumes and fragrances and lotions to seduce you the same way. So they learn how to rule over you by studying how nature ruled over us before we left our village-based societies. So basically during this golden age, again, humans were sovereign because there was abundance in plant life and everything was vegan before the first male hunters who created the snowball effect or ripple effect that destroyed the true ecosystem, creating this predator-prey style world that we are in today. This is not our natural state. Nothing is in its natural state. And so we have to get back to our natural state by understanding how we fail. So let's move on. During these gender wars, meat eating was becoming prevalent. It was like a disease. One thing I want to point out is so far what we've went over is that the first Holocaust that took place on the earth was the humans versus the animals. And that first Holocaust led to the gender wars, the matriarchs versus the patriarchs, because the women matriarchs that ruled over us with the secrets of the garden was totally against hunting. Now, when meat eating became prevalent, of course, it was male and female meat eaters. So, yeah, you had a lot of women that gave up their natural sovereignty in their natural place to be ruled over by males who would go out and hunt and provide the meat. So now male hunting cults became bigger and bigger and tools became more sophisticated. And this was the first beginnings of what we call slaughterhouses. So the first Holocaust was initiated on the animals, and all of the wars that took place on the earth after that is just a ripple effect of this first Holocaust. There were no wars prior to this. The first war that ever took place was man going to war against the animals. Now, again, these first male hunters became popular and rich when meat eating became prevalent. And they were like rock stars, just like the secret societies today. Your first secret societies were male hunting cults because hunting had to be done in secrecy when we was transitioning from matriarch to patriarch or pre-dynasty to dynastic time. Before the dynastic time, during this transitioning time of these gender wars, the male hunters were becoming like rock stars, just like how the dope dealers are like rock stars with everybody addicted to the crack. So these hunters became powerful because people was no longer dependent on the gardeners and the great grandmothers and the women who held the secrets of the trees and the vegan-based diet. People was no longer dependent on the plants. They were hooked on meat like we are today. Our diets was starting to change with this shift in consciousness and the beginning of this new age or new world. So with this rise of meat eating was a rise in dependency on male energy, on brute force. During these times, you had to get over your compassion to be able to kill an animal. I'm from the South. I've killed many animals in my life. And I can tell you every time that I've done it, I had to ignore my consciousness because I did feel like I was doing wrong, and I felt mercy, I felt compassion, but I had to ignore that in order to go ahead and kill the animal, because I was convinced that I had to eat meat in order to survive. So during this time when male hunters were becoming popular and meat eating was on the rise, people were dependent on what they call alpha males. And basically that was the male that could kill at will without having their emotions and feelings get in the way. You would be able to slaughter these animals without having any guilt or consciousness, because you have to be a different kind of person to work in a slaughterhouse. It have to be something that you were conditioned to do, because as a child, your first kill, I'm pretty sure it wasn't as easy as your kill when you were about 30 some years old. By then you conditioned to just ignore your consciousness. Not that it's not there anymore. It's just silent now because you've canceled it out. And we live in a world today that's a result of canceling out our consciousness. And I'm showing you how we fail in consciousness during this transition period. These first male hunters had to be brute men, or what they call alpha males, who was able to kill at will and not care about it. They had to be that way in order to go out and kill in massive numbers and provide the meat to these growing villages, because we were leaving a vegan-based diet to mainly meat-based diets, and these villages was growing. We entered an age of making more sophisticated tools to supply these demands of massive slaughtering and etc. And we had to make tools that would allow us to kill in bulk. So for the first time, man started to think of tools to cause destruction to other creatures. Now man started to fashion tools that would allow him to carry out massive death and genocide for the first time. And we practiced this evil upon the animals first. And if you fast forward time today, you can see we have perfected these sophisticated patriarchal tools of massive destruction. Prior to this, the only tools that we had were for working the earth and maintaining the garden. But with the rise of meat eating, our tools would become more sophisticated, and our tools would morph over time to support our new consciousness shift. So we went from simple, harmless gardening tools to tools that would support meat-eating, hunting-based societies, tools such as bow and arrows, swords, and eventually projectiles. And here we are today, still making some of the most vicious tools you can imagine based upon this downward spiral in consciousness that we've been under the past 7,000 years. And this downward spiral of consciousness is synonymous with the changing of our calendars and our diets. So the vegan-based cultures had calendars that were 360 days based around a perfect sphere, and we'll get into that later. But we need to understand that during the time of these gender wars, how the male hunters rose to power, and we no longer relied on gardeners. We now start to rely upon male hunters and big sophisticated tools. And when you fast forward time today, it's the same way. Male hunters and sophisticated tools and slaughterhouses and chemicals and steroids. And one of the first sophisticated tools that was created in agriculture was the plow. The reason the plow didn't exist during the golden age is because we didn't do what you would call massive scale agriculture back then. It was simply village-based agriculture. You reap what you sow. Meaning when you ate some food or you ate a watermelon, you just naturally spit the seeds out. So that's how the gardening was done. And of course, there was small gardens, but nothing major like we see today with the chemicals being sprayed and the unnatural factory GMO, because nothing was meant to be reproduced in mass that way. Nature already produces everything in mass. Nature created a system of us reproducing the plants, and it was through us eating the plants and throwing the waste down, what you call the waste down, the seeds and the hull. That was the natural way of gardening, along with small village style gardens. You reap what you sowed for your family What you ate was the seeds you kept to grow your next harvest, so you reap what you sowed. And there was a connection nature had with not only the humans, but with the animals, because it needs us to help spread these seeds around. So when we start to rely on male hunters and societies start to become meat-based societies, again, a lot of plant species went extinct with those animals, and a lot of places became barren. So we saw less vegetation and more slaughterhouses or cattle in concentrations like we see today. We see vast areas of deserted, barren areas and small little vegetated city areas where all of the agriculture is done on massive scales in a controlled, concentrated area. And it's controlled by men or families. And in order for you to eat of the land, you have to purchase it. Whereas everyone was naturally farmers or gardeners, because if you don't work, you don't eat. That's a natural saying that come from you sowing the seeds that would sustain your family and participating in your role in nature, being the vegan you were born to be. With the rise of male hunters, we didn't rely on the earth and on the knowledge of the women and the seeds. We didn't rely on that which would maintain abundance. We started to rely on the mass production of meat through slaughterhouses and the brute force of the male. And that's where we are today. In these meat-based societies, to feed your family, you got to go to work. And how these people rose to power and formed government was through the people getting addicted to meat. So the first hunters started getting rich because people didn't depend on the earth no more. That was when we all was rich. That was the golden age, when we all was vegan. When we left that and we started depending on male hunters, we was no longer rich, but the hunters were now rich because we depended on them and not the earth, which sustains us. So for them to provide meat to you and your family, you had to pay. And before money, you just paid with your labor. So you joined the hunting cult, and every man got a portion that was given to him and his family from the day's catch. And the biggest went to the founders of that hunting cult. And if you fast forward time to the day, instead of meat, it's just money. And everything trickled down to the bottom of the pyramid to what's called the peasants. So we eat the crumbs off the rich table. But before that, we just all ate abundantly from the ground, from the earth. You didn't eat the crumbs off the rich man table. But when we got addicted to meat and we entered these meat-eating societies and left the golden age, now we depended on men and we making them rich. So those first hunters controlled who would starve and who would not starve, when people didn't have to starve if they would simply go back to nature where there was an abundance. But if you was addicted to meat and I left you in a house full of fruits and vegetables, you'll starve all day before you make a meal out of them fruits and vegetables. I've seen meat eaters do this. They look around in the house and they say ain't nothing in here to eat, but they have all of these fruits stacked up in a bowl and have all of these veggies in the refrigerator. But since they don't have no meat, they say ain't nothing in here to eat, because they looking at all of these fruits and vegetables as side dishes. They've been taught to see that as side dishes. Now that I'm a vegetarian, my whole plate is filled up with what you would call side dishes. So they would starve if they had to go back to nature and couldn't catch an animal. So during this time when these male hunters rose to power, they was able to rise to power through the meat addiction of the people, the same way the drug dealers are able to have power over the people based upon you're vulnerable if you have an addiction. So when they started supplying the new currency, which was meat, because everybody was addicted to meat now, they control how much meat you get, who get how much meat and which cuts you get. During this time, there was a lot of wars going on based upon if you were an enemy of certain people during this time, you couldn't eat if you was addicted to meat. For example, if I was part of a certain cult, and at the end of the day, because of my high ranking in the cult, I get a huge share of the catchings, and then I got to take my huge share and then split it up and trickle it down amongst my people. Well, if I was a high-ranking member of that cult and had a huge share of the day's catching, and I was at war with someone at the bottom of the pyramid, then they wouldn't get a lot of supply from me. In other words, when males start to be in charge of feeding people through hunting, food became a tool of war now. Certain people who weren't liked, they starved. And the people who supplied the meat weren't supplied if we were enemies. So there were wars. Meat was a currency. It was a luxury, just like it is today. So these first male hunters started becoming very, very wealthy because the people who controlled the meat now started controlling the farms and agriculture like they do today. They growing the vegetables and the fruit, but they also got the slaughterhouses and the chickens and the cows. This go all the way back to the time I'm telling you now. The people who run all of these industries are what's called royal families. They control the main things that's needed to sustain us. And that's why they are in power. Nature once was in power and sustained everyone equally before people came in between us and nature and got control of the land. And how did they do it? Well, I'm telling you now. The first male hunting cults led up to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, which was the unification of the two world powers, Greece and Egypt, in the beginning of the New World Order, or the first United Treaty. That unification represents the end of those gender wars. Before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt was a series of gender wars. And I just explained to you what those gender wars was based upon. People who wanted to uphold the old world matriarchal ways of governing society and interacting with nature versus the new meat-eating cults and hunter-gathering societies that went against the natural laws of nature and messing up the earth today, taking us away from our vegan roots and natural roots. So during these gender wars, the matriarchs went to war with the patriarchs. And this was the second world war on the face of the earth, because the first war was man versus the animals that kicked us out of the garden. That's what sent us on an exodus out of the garden. And as we transition from pre-dynastic time to dynastic time, this second war during this transition in time is gender war, which was the first war of humans versus humans. And it was simply different humans that went to war based upon matriarch and patriarchal concepts. If you look at the world today, that's basically what's going on. Before the unification of Egypt, there was these gender wars, and Greece still existed during this time. This was called a proto-dynastic time, basically the transition in time between pre-dynastic and dynastic. And during this time was the establishment of the first kingdoms starting from 3100 BC. So they call this the beginning of dynastic time, but day one, year one on a Gregorian calendar is what we get when we count down from 3100 BC. And I will be going into that. I will go into that in detail. What we need to know right now before we can move forward is the nature of these gender wars and the difference between matriarchal societies versus patriarchal societies, veganism and gathering societies versus hunting gathering societies, or mainly meat-based societies. So there are no more vegan-based or gardening gathering societies today. They're either hunter gathering or just all right hunting. These superpower was rising on the strength of male hunting cults, which was getting control of the land. At first, we all had inheritances of the land, and it was a matrilineal system through the women, and everyone had their plot of land to sow their seeds. This was your natural inheritance. You had a family crest. With the unification of Egypt, that was the end of those gender wars, and the matriarch lost. So the patriarch's been in power ever since. You no longer have a family crest and an inheritance to the land. You now have a national flag and a citizenship, which is slavery. You can't go and reproduce or get anything from the land. You got to get it through those in power who have control over your inheritance, or the land, which is your inheritance. So we traded our natural inheritance when we started developing the meat-based diets, and we started building governments that would supply these new addictions and ideologies. And we had to rewrite our ideologies and even our spirituality, because the original spirituality had laws that governed against hunting. They were vegan-based laws. So with the rise of hunting societies came the rise of new calendars and new spiritual systems, because they had to make new spiritual laws to make hunting and meat eating okay. So the pre-dynastic timekeeping systems was also going away with all of the other pre-dynastic remnants. And the reason for that is because, again, during the golden age, when we were vegans, our calendars was based around the annual flooding that we depended on for our crops. And our calendars were basically based around nature and the growing of crops. Our calendars were 360 days because the ancestors looked at the sky as a canopy or a dome. And we go over that in so many videos, just check them out. So the sky was looked at as a dome, 360 degrees, and the pre-dynastic calendar was originally 12 months that were 30 days each. And that would give you a perfect 360. But the beginning of the Gregorian calendar, which marks the beginning of time according to the New World Order, has 365 days to account for Julius Caesar and Augustus calendar deception. The ancestors didn't name their months the same names that we have today. Julius Caesar and Augustus didn't exist during the Golden Age time, so you didn't have months called July and August. Yet people who talk about ancient things still base their time off a modern calendar. They still are under Pope Gregory's deception, telling you they're teaching you ancient concepts, when really the word ancient can't be used unless you're talking about pre-dynastic time. No one is going back pre-dynastic because most of the world today don't know about pre-dynastic time. That's the purpose of this series. This time is called Herstory. So the beginning of history is the end of Herstory, which leads us back to these gender wars. The hunters and their families were rising to power. And the bigger your hunting cult was, the people at the top of that cult ran entire villages once these villages were converting into meat-based villages. So you still had a couple of villages scattered out that were solely vegan. And then you had your hunting villages and hunting-gathering villages. And that's what the wars were. These groups of villages going to war based upon ideologies, social structure. Now, to make a long story short, these gender wars over many years led up to the unification of Greece and Egypt under Narmer. And basically that unification was your biggest villages that had unified. Because during these gender wars, a lot of the matriarchal villages were united. So, of course, you know, your hunting villages would connect and combine forces as well. What was happening was meat eating was becoming very prevalent. The taste for meat and cooking had began because tools were now sophisticated to support cooking the meat and the meat eating. Men started to now experiment more with fire, which would lead to projectiles. During this gender war transitioning period, which was a couple thousand years, meat eating became prevalent. And a lot of these villages more and more were becoming more hunting gathering villages than gardening and vegan-based gathering villages. So there start to be more meat-eating societies than vegan-based societies. And now we was entering the beginning of the end of the old world and the beginning of the new world with that transitioning of our diets. Remember that drastic changes in societies are synonymous with the changes in the way those societies interact with the land, which has a huge effect on the diets of those societies. Most of the time, there's a huge change in the diets based upon the huge change in the consciousness Again, as I said, vegan-based societies had a different spirituality and consciousness that prevented them from eating animals, and they understood the knowledge of nature and being green. The rise of the hunting societies meant turning the back on old spiritual practices and people rebelling on their grandmothers and mothers' vegan ways of the old world, adopting new ideologies that supported hunting societies and said that meat eating is okay. And I'm going to show you later in this series how every society transitioned, how they left veganism goddesses in their spirituality to male meat-eating condoning patriarchal gods in their religions. But first we have to start here at these gender wars and understand what was taking place on the earth. Meat eating was becoming prevalent, and the old ways of the natural golden age were dying. And that led up to the patriarch ruling and being put on a throne, which ended those gender wars with the unification of the first two world powers. And those first two world powers were born out of royal families. And those royal families was born from rich hunting cults. The hunting cults got control over the land and the people through the people's addiction and the change of their diet. And when the people gave up their land to go to work to put meat on their plate, the people who own the slaughterhouses also gained ownership of the gardens or the land that the people own. So your first world governments and the first rulers of the earth, you often forget that these pharaohs and kings own thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land and cattle and farms and slaughterhouses. And it's these things that sustain us: food, water, shelter, and the earth provides it all. So when we became addicted to the meat and not addicted to that which sustains us, which is nature, now we're like junkies waiting on the dope man, as opposed to gardeners who was getting our hands dirty, interacting with nature, doing what we were supposed to do to feed ourselves abundantly. So the first world government took place in Egypt with this unification of the Egyptians and the Greeks or the Romans. And during this time, these two cultures, like most of the world, was in a very mixed setting. So we're looking at an Egypt that was full of all quote unquote races. And there had to be, in order for there to be this unification. Today, a lot of people don't want to acknowledge the fact that Egypt was very mixed during the beginning of these first dynasties, and there was more than one ruler. So this unification was the beginning of world government. And when we talk about Egyptians, every culture identified themselves as Egyptian, and for many years the different quote-unquote races have argued about who are really the Egyptians. Because when you start going through Egypt, you see the influence of all the quote-unquote races, just like if you were to go through America. It was a melting pot. During this time, you had people of all races who ate meat and people of all races who hate meat, who were vegans. This was matriarchal versus patriarchal, and it was people of all different shades on each side. There have always been since the beginning of this war. What we became to know as Greece and Egypt today was birthed from a union of autonomous villages and a war that took place from those villages transitioning from gathering societies or gardening societies to hunting societies. So needless to say, the hunting societies won that war, and here we are today. So the end of those gender wars represented the victory of those patriarchal hunting societies and the beginning of government under this one guy who they call Narmer, who's known by many names. We're going to talk about him more later. But he's just a pseudonym for the real powers who are hiding themselves behind this fake history.